Today's session is how to secure your small business from IT and cybersecurity threats. My name is Cathy Miron. I am the CEO of eSilo and also a SCORE volunteer. Today's agenda will cover a couple of housekeeping items. I want to go over your goals for the session and make sure we cover those. And then we'll spend a good amount of time on the foundation of a good IT strategy, knowing what you have to protect, how to protect it, the top threats that you might face, and then some key risks and controls. Because of our late start, I'll probably go a little bit quickly, so feel free to just ask a question or comment in the chat if you need me to slow down or cover anything. But first, just real quick housekeeping. If you're not familiar with the Zoom window, here's the chat on the right-hand side. I'm going to be asking you to put some comments in there just so I can get a little bit of feedback. It's hard when you're all virtual and you don't get to see folks live. So first, as a quick icebreaker, if in the chat you could just put your name, your business, and what your goals are for today's session, that'll help me ensure I tailor the content to what it is that you want to get out of today. So first, I'm going to start off with a couple of questions to get to know what type of business owner are you. The first question is going to be, are you a digital native or a digital immigrant? And if you're not sure what that means, I think this picture will help. So here's a picture of a bunch of digital natives, right? They grew up in the era of technology. And then here's a picture of a typical digital immigrant. So just drop native or immigrant in the chat to let me know which one of these you feel like you are. Similarly, do you tend to do IT yourself, or do you hire experts? Do you see technology as helping to streamline your business operations, or do you find that it holds you back? And do you view technology as an opportunity to play offense, or something where you need to focus on defense, where you're more concerned about the threats and the worries that it can cause? So just drop those into the chat for me, and that will help me understand you guys a little bit better. But what I would tell you is the reality is technology can be your greatest asset, but also your greatest weakness. So it's a little bit of a double-sided coin. So with the right technology, it can help you sell more, increase productivity, and get a complete 360-degree view of your customers. But when it's not well implemented or maintained, it can be your weakest link, leading to business downtime, loss of revenue, loss of customers, operational disruptions, and ultimately loss of money and reputation if you fall victim to cybercrime. And in today's era, trust is key. If you're in finance, accounting, law, or insurance, your clients expect you to know how to handle their data. And professional associations and regulatory bodies are also holding you to very high standards. Once that trust is lost, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to recover. So in today's session, we're going to cover a combination of strategy and tactics. As business owners, it's important to understand the what and the why before diving into the how, especially because in many cases, you're not going to be the person who's hands-on keyboard doing all of the work. You might be doing the IT in your business today, but as you grow, you'll most likely hire competent firms to help you in the more complex areas. And today's training is meant to be a foundation for you to understand what you should be doing now and what you should be looking for in the future as you grow. So by the end of the session, you'll understand why small businesses are targeted, how to evaluate your IT risk, prioritize your limited investment dollars, and implement critical security controls. But first, it's only fair to at least introduce myself and let you know a little bit about me. So as I said, my name is Cathy Miron. I'm the president of eSilo. We are a data protection, data backup, and cybersecurity services company based in Jupiter. And we help small businesses protect their data and avoid downtime from disasters, mistakes, and cyber threats. I'm also a board member at the South Florida Tech Association, where I work with local tech companies from digital marketing agencies to software development and AI. And our mission is to build South Florida into an attractive place for folks to build a tech career and to grow their tech businesses. and I'm a small business mentor with SCORE. Specifically, I focus on technology, so I'm a technology SME, and I mostly help small business owners like yourself who have questions about, what systems to deploy or how to keep themselves safe online, where to make smart IT investments. And I started my career at GE. I was there for 14 years and spent 9 of those years in various audit and consulting engagements, really focused on advising on security and compliance for both regulated and unregulated businesses. So here's a snapshot of where I was lucky enough to audit and work. Had a chance to assess multi-million-dollar systems projects to ensure that they were accurate, secure, and complete, and also see different examples of how IT is done well or not well in many areas. And through that experience, I worked with a bunch of different regulatory standards, industry standards, and what I will tell you is that across the board, from financial services to healthcare, aviation to energy, the requirements around IT and the protection of data may look different and have different regulations behind them, but by and large, the controls that these bodies expect are very similar. So just to get us kind of started on the security topic, I wanted to tell with you a real life story about ransomware. And this is from a client of mine. They weren't a client when this happened, but this is kind of the impetus for how we met. So the gentleman's name is Tom, and he runs a family-owned and operated citrus distribution company local here to Florida. And they had been in business for a long, long time. And to Tom's dismay, he came in early one Monday morning and found all of the data on his computer was encrypted. And unfortunately, on his screen was a ransomware demand asking for payment of $70,000 in Bitcoin in order to get his files back. And so the first thing that Tom did, right, he was incredibly distraught, was ask himself, well, how on earth could this have happened? And when you think about most ransomware attacks and where they originate, they often start with a phishing email. So this is a carefully crafted email that looks like it's from a legitimate source or a contact that you know, asking you to open an attachment or click on a malicious link. And in this case, it was a supplier or an email that looked like it came from a supplier, telling a member of his staff to open up the attachment to view their latest purchase order. By clicking on the link, the machine was infected with malware, and the attackers were able to do reconnaissance for several days before beginning to encrypt the files over the weekend. And it is common that a lot of ransomware attacks are discovered either by an employee working over the weekend or first thing Monday morning when folks come in to start the week. So poor Tom, he's sitting here thinking, what do I do, right? How do I get my files back? And he's really facing 2 bad options. Either choose to lose, right, part with his $70,000, or choose to part with his data. So what do you think he did next? Drop some comments in the chat. So we'll come back to Tom's story a little bit later. But first I want to do some level setting. So every business is a digital business, whether you identify with that or feel like you're one or not. And really that's because today digital is data. If you have data, you're digital. So this may not have been true, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, or even 2 years ago. But nowadays in every industry, including traditionally personalized and face-to-face industries like healthcare and law, have now changed how that they deliver services to get to end consumers. So the question you should be asking yourself is technology helping you better reach and serve your customers, or are you getting left behind? So how many of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Abraham Maslow was a famous psychologist and professor back in the 1940s. And he published the theory of human motivation, which basically says that human beings need essential physiological needs to be taken care of, like food, water, and shelter, before they can worry about higher order things like health and safety, well-being, relationships, self-esteem, and ultimately self-actualization. I've adapted that model And I look at it through the lens of a small business's IT needs. And when you think about it in this sense, you know, the most important thing that your systems need to do are power on and perform their function, right? Serve their purpose, make sure that your systems are working. Once they are working and you have your basic needs met, the next step is to make sure that the data and systems are secure and safe. And only then can you or should you be able to focus on how technology helps enable more efficient process and productivity, how it can help you grow and differentiate yourself in the marketplace, and then ultimately how you can use technology to disrupt your competition and really truly innovate. But for most small businesses, they're focusing on higher order items without enough care and attention and understanding of their foundational layers. And just like you would never build a house on a shaky foundation, building on a bad systems foundation is just inviting trouble for yourself. So let's unpack those two. From an availability perspective, you're interested in ensuring the accessibility of systems so that your staff can use them, and the continuity of operations so that processing occurs timely and as expected. At the security layer, you have the CIA trifecta, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. And all this really means is you need to guarantee that there is no unauthorized access to that information, that data is accurate and complete and accessible when needed by the business. So as a small business owner, you may be thinking my data is not important enough or valuable enough for someone to want to steal. And the reality is you're wrong. Aside from having useful data like payment information, personally identifiable information, PII or SPII, which would be sensitive PII, even if what you have isn't worth a lot of dollars on the black market, the bad guys know that the data is valuable to you, and that small businesses have limited resources and a low tolerance for downtime. So if they hold your data hostage, you're more than likely going to be willing to pay to get it back if they set the price right. So understanding, now that we've got that as a backdrop, I want to shift over into understanding what you have to protect and what we're really trying to accomplish with small business security. So here's a very simplistic diagram. And I would suppose that the main goal here is to secure data at rest, whether that's in the cloud or on endpoints. And then of course to secure data in transit, right? If you cover those three, you've got the basics, if I oversimplify what we're trying to accomplish here. So as far as cloud security, you can put the right authentication controls in place, multi-factor, strong passwords, things like that. That's how you would secure those repositories and ensure that it's less likely for someone unauthorized to gain access to the data inside. For devices, you would typically install antivirus or an anti-malware type solution to prevent those devices from being infected with bad software. And then as far as the transmission, you're going to want to ensure that that data is encrypted so that there can't be prying eyes viewing the data as it's sent between your machines and the cloud. And that's really important when you look at, you know, a highly mobile workforce where you're on public Wi-Fi and you're on networks that are known to be unsafe, where there's a lot of other rogue devices. But with many of us working from home during the COVID-19 pandemic, you still have those protected devices, you still have secure methods of transmission and encrypting the data, but you've got this new variable, which is all the other people, devices, and things in your home that may be connected to the internet. And specifically, the Internet of Things, so your smart thermometer, your smart TV, your smart security cameras, your voice assistants, and any printers, scanners, faxes, all of those things have outbound or have active network connections, and they're not possible to protect with your traditional antivirus or anti-malware software. So in that scenario, right, you typically would assume that your home network is protected and secure, but is it? You don't really know. And this is where a whole home network firewall or smart firewall would come into play. So this is an example of for a typical user. If you're part of a small office, there's a lot more components. And again, this is a busy picture, but it's also a very simplified picture. And I'll run through this pretty quickly just in the interest of time. But we'll start and unpack these key elements, one by one. So the first is the servers. And a server is nothing more than a large and more powerful computer. They come in a couple of different forms, whether it's a desktop style or a rack mount style, and they can be located physically in the office or in someone else's cloud. And when we say cloud, it really just means it's in someone else's data center where they take care of the servers, the storage, the network. You don't have to worry about any of that. You just pay them for the percentage of utilization that you use. So it's a nice model. But that's all that cloud really means. So with servers, the main risk factor is going to be that they're misconfigured in a way that would allow unauthorized users to gain system access. And of course, you've got the traditional threats that any computing equipment is going to have. Loss of power, server crashes can lead to data corruption. Any single points of failure can lead to prolonged outages and downtime. And hard drives have a typical lifespan of 4 to 5 years. So those will also fail over time. So the best practices for server management is really to insulate yourself with good hardware, replace frequently, good warranties, regular data backups, and having an uninterruptible power source from a battery backup standpoint. When you think about end user devices, the risks are a little bit different. They're mobile in nature, so they're harder to control because the devices and the data are distributed. And they're also more prone to loss, theft, or damage. And you can't forget on the peripheral side, printers and scanners. So they're often there in the office and nobody gives them a second thought, but they've got hard drives and they're connected to the internet, as I mentioned before. So they're retaining copies of sensitive data, and they can also be used as gateways to your network and to other machines on the network. So you want to make sure you dispose of those properly and secure your network with a firewall, as we mentioned. So best practices for end user devices, similar to servers. You want to buy quality hardware with a good warranty. You want to be on Windows 10 if you're not already, because Windows 7 support Windows 7 is no longer supported, and therefore you're not going to be able to get security patches and things like that. And you want to make sure that when you're done with your devices and your data, or your hard drives rather, that you dispose of them properly in accordance with ISO 27001 standards. But lastly, the most important one I think for small businesses is to either not allow the use of personal devices at work, or if you are going to allow them, make sure that you've got strict controls over data leakage. How do you handle employee terminations? And how you get that data back, and then also ensuring you have good backup since that data is residing on a machine that the company doesn't control. So why keep a local on-site backup? This is mainly for speed of recovery and ensuring that downtime can be minimized when data is restored. There's a couple of other reasons as well, be that either for control purposes, where you want to maintain complete control, ensure that the data is in your possession, and not have any dependency on outside vendors or internet connectivity to do your backups and restores. So often larger businesses will have an on-site backup server. And then we get into the network. So you've got a couple of different pieces of equipment, network equipment in a typical small office. Wi-Fi is there mostly for convenience. It's not to discourage it, but it's not as reliable, fast, or secure as a wired connection. If you are using Wi-Fi in the office, you want to make sure that you at least have WPA2 encryption to prevent rogue access. And then your firewall is really your key for network security. So it restricts inbound and outbound traffic according to certain rules, and it basically protects your internal network from external threats. So when you look broader and you zoom out from just the small office view, then you're starting to look at different cloud services that might be in use by your business or by employees in your business. And that's all connected through the WAN. So if you hear that term, all it means is the wide area network. The one thing I will mention is, and I've seen this with a lot of small businesses, is minimum connectivity speeds for their connection to their internet service provider. So we always say it as a minimum, you're going to want 50 megabits per second download and 10 megabits per second upload. That way, if you're doing multiple Zoom meetings, you're syncing files to 365 or Google Drive, or using third-party backup providers like eSilo, all of that traffic can proceed without clogging your internet connection. And that's especially important if you've got other members of the household that might be doing distance learning or streaming videos on YouTube. All right, so we rushed through that a little bit fast, but what I want to do right now is focus a little bit on the top threats from a cybersecurity perspective. But first, basic terminology. I want to make sure that I'm not using terms that folks might not be familiar with. So malware is just an umbrella term. It's basically malicious software. Malware is kind of how they made the term. And it includes both viruses and ransomware. So ransomware, as we already covered, is a specific type of malware that restricts access to data and holds data hostage. It's been around since the 1980s, even though it seems like a newer threat, and it's mainly used to extort you for money. Whereas viruses can spread from computer to computer, and their primary goal is to give access or grant access to your system so that data can be stolen or exfiltrated. And lastly, phishing. So phishing is a cleverly crafted email, or they are social phishing attacks these days. That's going to be the most popular method for delivery of malware. Oftentimes they'll have you open in a malicious email or go to a fake website that looks like your bank's website or Microsoft, and they'll use that to steal your credentials. So this slide was one that I took in 2019 for a different presentation, and you can see how dominated it is by ransomware headlines. And the FBI said that in 2019, there was a new ransomware victim every 14 seconds. So it just tells you how pervasive these attacks were. But you fast forward to 2020, and we have this surge in COVID-19 related scams and attacks. So 192,000 COVID attacks each week since the pandemic started. And these are coming by email, text, and phone. It might look like something, get your COVID vaccine or order your COVID test kit. And there's been some contact tracing spoofing where people have gotten text messages that say, oh, you've been in contact with someone who's tested positive, click here to see, where they were and get a list of things to do about it. So unfortunately, just like anything, cyber criminals are taking advantage of, current events and fear and using that to their own gain. But the most interesting thing that I've heard of recently is this idea of cyber pandemics. And the whole thinking being that a cyber attack can spread just as fast, if not faster and farther than a biological virus, and lay dormant for weeks, months, affecting a large number of hosts that might share a common set of vulnerabilities. So maybe weaknesses in Windows or certain types of software like Adobe or Java that are not patched timely, and ultimately bringing on the potential for a digital shutdown that could be catastrophic to the economy. So very scary stuff. And in 2013, at the end of her tenure as the US Secretary for Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano gave this quote, that our country will at some point face a major cyber threat that will have a serious impact on our lives, our economy, and the everyday functioning of our society. And if that wasn't scary enough, when you look at the statistics for small businesses, you can see that 43% of last year's attacks hit SMBs, and only 14% of them were prepared for those attacks, leaving 60% to go out of business within 6 months. So the question you should be asking yourself is, how do you feel you would fare? So prevention is always everybody's focus. How do I prevent attacks, keep myself safe? And while prevention is really important, and experts recommend a defense in depth approach, which means layered security controls at different within different areas of your infrastructure, much like you might rely on multiple defenses in your home. So you would close windows and doors, turn on the alarm, have security cameras. You need to do something similar from an IT perspective, right? So patch vulnerabilities to close or to fix security bugs, implement good firewall rules so that only certain traffic is allowed in or out, implement logging, alerting, strong passwords. All of these things help to improve your security posture so that even if an attacker gets through a couple of the external layers, they're going to hit more roadblocks that are going to prevent them, that are going to stop them in their tracks before they actually reach your most sensitive systems and data. But prevention is never 100%. So humans will always be the weakest link, which is why security training is so important, right? You can have the best security around your home, but if somebody who lives inside opens the door to a potential attacker thinking that they're someone benign, then they've defeated all of your defenses in a heartbeat. And so having a solid resiliency strategy really pays off. And this is where backups, whether they're offsite and or offline, and having multiple copies of your system and data ensures that when, not if, but when an attack happens, when you experience data loss, you're able to get back to work quickly. So the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report is a very well-known, authoritative source. They study thousands of breaches and issue a new report every year on trends and observations. And this year's report was interesting for two main reasons. One was that the security incidents and the confirmed breaches were 2 to 4 times larger than what was published in last year's report. So the pace of incidents is clearly on the rise. And then secondly, when you look at this analysis of time between when a system is compromised on the left-hand side, right, and data is exfiltrated, it's within seconds or minutes. As soon as the system is compromised, the bad guys are copying off data. And then over on the bottom right-hand side, you're seeing that companies or victims are often not discovering these breaches until months, if not weeks, months, years afterwards. And then it takes them another several days to contain those threats once they've been detected. So that gives the bad guys plenty of time to do their thing and steal data and drive harm. So how do you protect yourself? So here's where we get into our content. First, any discussion of security needs to start with risk. And risk is simply a factor of likelihood and impact. So how likely is an event to happen? And if it happens, or if it comes to fruition, what is going to be the impact on your business? Now, it's not possible to mitigate every single possible risk. It's not practical. Even if you had an unlimited budget, you wouldn't want to. But you should be looking at a chart like this and thinking in terms of what do you think is the most likely type of threat or type of risk to my business, and which of these downstream impacts would be most crippling. And then once you've got a view of your risk tolerance and what for your business model, for your industry, you feel is the most important risks to address, then you can map it against a set of controls. And this is an example. It's a control list that I've used before, and I've adapted it from the Center for Information Security. Your list doesn't need to be as lengthy or detailed because this tends to be a little bit more sophisticated for a larger organization with more complex IT. But the whole idea is that you plot your risks against your controls, and you look for key controls that would help you mitigate those risks if the control was working effectively. Now, you want to be reasonable with all of this. Some controls just may not be applicable to your company or your situation. And so what I've pulled out in the next couple of slides is a few of the most critical ones that I think apply universally. And the pages are a little information dense, so everybody take a deep breath with me. So security awareness training. As we've said before, humans are often the weakest link, and you need to train them on how to spot clever phishing attacks, social engineering attacks, and other things, right? Proper information handling practices. by offering regular security training, you've got a 72% of significantly reducing the impact of an attack. So train folks according to their job function and the nature of the data that they're going to have exposure to. Do it at least yearly, but if you can do weekly micro trainings or other newsletters that put information security topics, in front of them on a regular basis, it'll help keep it top of mind. And consider doing a skill gap assessment to understand where are some of the weaknesses or areas where the overall knowledge of your team is less, and you want to address those with a education roadmap. Secondly is the concept of controlled access or kind of least privilege, which basically just means that you want to make sure that people only have access to the information necessary to perform their jobs and not more than what they would realistically need day to day. And so in order to compartmentalize that sensitive information, you want to have role-based access, so an understanding of each job function in the business, what systems they need access to, what data do they need, and ensure that admin roles or roles for other functional areas or other modules of a system aren't given to somebody who doesn't need it, doesn't need it necessarily. And so on the topic of admins, oftentimes in breaches you find that regular user accounts are breached and bad guys use privilege escalation to essentially create themselves or migrate into roles with greater and greater privileges where they can do more damage and harm. So it's that much more important to control the use of admin accounts. So having a list of all of the admin accounts in the business and making sure that that list is reviewed periodically. Where possible, don't have users transact in those admin accounts on a day-to-day basis. So a simple example is on your Windows machine, you don't want to be logged in as a local admin user, because that means if you were to accidentally download some bad software or some website tries to download bad software, if you're logged in as an admin, you have less opportunity to stop that attack in its tracks than if you were logged in as a regular user and you have to explicitly give your password to elevate your privileges to admin to approve the installation or the execution of that software. So on the topics of passwords, they're falling out of fashion, as you may have seen. They're easy to guess, too hard to remember, and it drives users to bad behaviors like putting them on sticky notes or writing down in a book. Multi-factor authentication is really the single best control against account compromise, and so many attacks originate with compromised credentials that if MFA is offered on a software system that you're using, definitely enable it without question, but it's not always available. So if not supported, you want to make sure that you're using unique and complex passwords, you're storing them in a password manager, and if it's available, you want to use out-of-band authentication, which is like that SMS code that your bank might send you for high-risk apps that don't have full code generators. And then lastly, the other thing I'll mention is before you deploy a new piece of equipment, change the default password for the admin account on your router from Comcast, as an example. These are really simple, basic things that most users don't remember to do, and it makes it really easy for bad guys to get into those systems and through them to other things on your network. So data backup and recovery, we've done that a little bit before, but really this control is all about protecting your data from loss caused by a variety of different issues, whether those be disasters or cyber attacks or just commonplace hardware failure. Backups should all be automated, done at least daily, and be complete, meaning they're full system images in addition to files and data, which give you the most flexible options for recovery. But backups are only good if they are recoverable. So you periodically test the recovery, and that's both to ensure that they're good and intact, but also so that you practice the recovery. So when a crisis occurs and you need to quickly recover, you're not fumbling through looking at manuals or searching knowledge articles online trying to do that. So most importantly, though, with backup is to follow the 3-2-1 rule. So for that, we're going to go back to our friend Tom. So here's Tom, right? He's facing this lose-lose scenario. But Tom's thinking, hey, I was pretty smart. I have a couple of sets of backups because I was following the 3-2-1 rule. So I'm going to go ahead and recover from backup. And first, why backups are important. In this example, we're saying that on Friday, Tom would have had a really good backup, right? On Saturday, Sunday, Monday, that's when his files started to get encrypted, and he discovers the ransomware first thing Monday morning. So within minutes and hours, he's able to roll back to his last known good backup, which was Friday, and then be off to the races and working back to work, or at least so he thought. So the 3-2-1 rule with data backup is that you want to have at least 3 copies of data, so your primary production copy and at least 2 backups, and that those backups should be stored on at least 2 different types of media. So whether that's an internal hard disk, removable USB drive, thumb drive, cloud storage, tape, there's a lot of different ways to satisfy this requirement. And at least one of those copies needs to be stored off-site, or at least physically removed from the local network where your primary machines are stored. So Tom said, I feel pretty good, even though the situation's pretty bad, because I followed the 3-2-1 rule. So, back to Monday morning, we're looking at a situation where PCs can't log in, servers infected. He does have on-site backups, so he's feeling pretty good about that. And he has off-site backups too, so he's feeling really good about his situation. But what he forgot is that, especially when it comes to on-site backups, if your removable USB drive or on-site backup servers on the same network as your other infected machines, it is highly likely that your backups get infected and therefore are rendered useless. And similarly, for Tom at least, which was in the unfortunate case, he went to restore from his offsite backups, but found that they were inaccessible because someone had set them up years ago, had encrypted his backups with a unique password, and nobody could find that password or get to it once all the systems were locked. So unfortunately, Tom was in a pretty bad spot. So this is why we say the 3-2-1 rule that's common in the industry is not enough. Additionally, you want to add a 1 and a 0. So one of those copies you want to make sure is completely immutable, meaning it cannot be tampered with. And then the 0 is for 0 errors, meaning people get a little complacent sometimes with backups that just run, and after a couple of days or a couple of weeks of checking the reports, they just assume that they're always going to run. And lo and behold, they don't realize that weeks ago, months ago, there was some kind of an error and the backups actually had stopped working or were not intact. And of course, backups and their passwords must be accessible from the machine after a disaster event, which is where poor Tom fell down. So back to control, we only have one more of these, wireless devices. So if you are going to use wireless in your office, you do want to make sure that you're, to the extent possible, separating guest traffic or untrusted devices from those of any core machines on your network, so the core workstations that your employees are using. You're disabling Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, NFC if they're not needed for business purposes. You're securing the Wi-Fi itself, and also if you've got staff members that travel, that you're using VPN if you're going to be on public Wi-Fi to make sure that all of your transmissions are secured and you can't have any eavesdroppers. So IT controls are really like a puzzle. They can't stand alone. They have to work together to build a wall, but walls are not impervious, right? So you have to expect that even if you build the best wall, there is going to be water leaking through, and you have to have a good response plan for how you deal with cyber attacks. So in summary, security has to be a priority for every small business. It requires an equal measure of prevention and response. And really, companies need to be lucky all the time. Attackers only need to get lucky to get in. And when you think about your hierarchy of IT needs, or really how you prioritize your IT investment, IT activities, you got to start with availability and security and make sure that your business has a solid operational foundation before you start focusing on hierarchies and growth and differentiation. If you don't spend equal parts, at least, on defense and offense, then you might find yourself in an untenable situation. So with that, we've got a couple of resources here that I'll mention quickly if anybody wanted to stay up to date on different cybersecurity topics. The first is a podcast that I have my Google Assistant read to me every morning. They publish Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, but it's a very simple, consumer-oriented, easy to understand, 5-6 minute podcast on current events and what you can do about common threats that other businesses are facing. And then the US Computer Emergency Response Team, they publish a bunch of different alerts and educational tips. Some are very technical, but tips series is great for non-techies. And in the event that hopefully you don't need it, but if you ever do experience a data breach, also go to their website and file a report. And then lastly, I've got a couple of social media groups where I am curating these, where we can share tips, tools, tricks across business owners. And it gives a safe forum for business owners to ask questions and just get some basic cyber IT related advice. So I would encourage you to look for those groups. It's Tech Tips for Business on LinkedIn, and we have a similar one in Facebook. So with that, I will see if there are any questions in the chat. Feel free. Father Hamilton is asking, is phishing discovered via the protective software? I'm sorry, I guess I didn't see the chat while I was chatting earlier. Certain types of software can help you identify phishing attacks. These are mostly going to be run on the email provider side. So it would include commonly spam filter to filter out spam messages, as well as flag potential phishing emails. In different softwares work differently. Some will prevent the phishing email from ever being delivered to the end user. Others deliver it, but strip links in the attachment and use it as an educational opportunity. And they flag it with a banner that says, hey user, this was a suspicious email. Here's why we removed different things. And we sent you this example so you know what to look for in the future. Good question. And also asked a question about the Friday backup in my example before. And no, the Friday backup was good. It was a good backup. It was the Saturday backup, the Sunday backup, and the Monday morning backup, if there was one, that were bad, which is why when Tom got to Monday morning, he restored the Friday backup, which was the last known good one. Do I suggest cyber insurance for small businesses? Yes, Kevin, I do. The one thing I will say is, depending on the nature of your business, the coverage that you need will vary. So I'm a technology company, so I have a much higher set of coverage limits and breach protection, identity theft remediation, forensics. So what I'm planning for is going to be a lot different than, say, someone who owns a consulting business or a retail store or whatever. But yes, I would definitely suggest cyber insurance. And if you need a link to a couple of resources that'll offer you free quotes where you can compare from different providers, just let me know. So Sibla asks, and I'm sorry if I pronounced her name wrong, what is a firewall and how do you install one? So there's a bunch of different types of firewalls, but for simplicity's sake, since in the presentation I really talked only about a network firewall, there are a lot of consumer grade devices you can buy for your home. If you Google like smart router or smart firewall, there's a couple that'll come up. If you want a specific recommendation, I'd be happy to share with you offline if you're interested. But these devices, the ones you're going to want to look for are going to be really plug and play. Typically in a larger organization, in an enterprise with IT resources, firewalls are dedicated server-looking devices that have very complex rule set and very advanced settings for what types of traffic you would allow or disallow on different ports, et cetera, et cetera. For small business purposes, and especially if you don't have IT help, you want one that's plug and play, where basically they're going to already have prefigured a set of rules for ports to block, activity that would look suspicious that you would want to block at the network layer. And those require minimal to no configuration on the part of the end user, but good ones will provide a web dashboard where you can actually log in and see the attacks that are blocked in real time. You can also turn on or off different settings like ad blocking or protected safe browsing, web protection, where they're going to encrypt your DNS queries, or they're going to encrypt the website requests of which sites you're going to see for privacy reasons. So, those are some of the types of features that you want to look for in a typical firewall. Thomas says, I have a new computer with MS Defender, so Microsoft Windows Defender is the built-in antivirus. Is that adequate versus malware or other free and paid anti-malware softwares? And I would say it's actually pretty good because Windows has been targeted so many attacks over the years. They've really had to beef up their security tools and posture. So especially with Windows 10, there's a lot more settings and things that you're able to do natively within Windows if you know what to look for, what to do. I would tell you that with antivirus or anti-malware software, there's really two groups, two flavors. One is going to be more of your traditional signature-based, which is when the providers of the software have a giant database of malicious code that they've seen in the wild, different snippets. We call them fingerprints, right? So each piece of code has kind of a unique fingerprint, and there's a giant or signature, and there's a giant database of these things. So as you download a piece of software and try to run it on your computer, your antivirus will then check that piece of software against its signature database, and if there's a match, it's going to block it for you. That's great for known threats, but especially in a business setting, if you're dealing with really sensitive data or strict regulatory requirements, you may want to look at next-gen antivirus or anti-malware, which would be AI-driven. So this is where, in addition to the signatures, the researchers have identified common behaviors that typical malware and bad software will exhibit. And so even if they detect a piece of software that isn't in the signature database, right, it's a brand new zero-day threat, if it's exhibiting one of these suspicious behaviors, it'll get blocked and quarantined. So this just gives you a much more proactive opportunity to get in front of those threats. Pauline asked about Norton. That she's had some bad experiences and wondering if they're any better. I don't use Norton myself, so I can't say. As a general comment, I will say that the security industry is progressing so quickly, and in software in general, right? New versions and iterations are coming out really fast. So if it's been a while, and especially Norton has a lot of free trials or free subscriptions that get bundled with your cable provider or a new machine that you might have bought. So it certainly doesn't hurt to use it. It would be better than not using it at all. But of course, there are definitely going to be better alternatives out there as well. Alejandro asks, how safe is the use of a Chromebook? Chromebooks are actually pretty good. What's nice about Chromebooks is they have very minimal storage. So when you think about the goal of an attacker breaking into your computer to steal data or corrupt your system, a Chromebook has very little data. Its primary goal is for web browsing. I'm not as familiar though. I don't really use one day-to-day myself, so I wouldn't be able to speak to what kind of anti-malware type software exists for Chromebooks. But if that's something that you want me to look at, just shoot me a quick note and I'd be happy to follow up on that for you. And Fabiola is asking if we can share the replay. So yes, definitely. I will work with the folks at SCORE to get that sent out to you guys, and slides as well. If anyone's interested, I can send that to you. And Sibylia, what would be a better alternative to Norton? So there's a lot of different tools, and as a volunteer, I have to be impartial. So I'm not necessarily allowed to point you in the direction one way or another. But I will tell you that some of the big brands that are out there are going to be things like Bitdefender, Cylance, WebRoot. I know a lot of people use Avast, a lot of small businesses. I personally am not a huge fan of it because I get spammed with stuff all the time. I use it for a short period of time. And I think they use some interesting tactics to get you to upgrade to higher tiers of the software, a little bit of scare tactics, which I'm not a huge fan of. But there's a lot of different ones out there. If you just Google next gen antivirus for Windows, Mac, whatever kind of machine you're using, you should be able to find some good options. And I realized that I was so excited by the questions that we're a couple minutes over. So I know we probably didn't get a chance to answer everything, although I'm glad we went through a couple. I will drop my email into the chat here. If anybody wants to email me, or here's my LinkedIn. If you have, if you want to friend me on LinkedIn, whatever, invite me to connect on LinkedIn. If you want to join any of our Tech Tips for Business groups, I would love to answer your questions there, because a lot of folks that I speak to have very similar questions, and I think it's great if they can all benefit from the answers. So please join those groups, reach out to me, and we will make sure we get the replay out to everybody. All right, thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate it. Talk to you soon.